My name is Jen Riddell. I am a plant biologist and I am with the California Native Plant Society today.
Hi, my name is Michael Jones. I am the University of California Cooperative Extension Forest Advisor for Mendocino Lake and Sonoma counties.
Hello, I'm Mary Maeda. I'm the North Coast Forester for the Natural Resources Conservation Service.
So the goal for today is to provide context for work in fuels reduction. So fuel load reduction work is often very expensive. We want to help crews have an idea about the decisions that they're going to make in terms of what plants to cut, what plants to leave, when you limb a plant up, when you would cut it all the way to the ground, and get a little bit of a context of what kinds of plants they're going to encounter when they're out working.
I can say a little something. There's a lot of talk about how to conduct your defensible space clearing around your homes, and today we're going to really look at how you do that outside that 100 feet. How can we reduce fuels while still having a light touch on the landscape so that we are not only reducing fuels and fire hazard, but also increasing forest health and productivity?
The goal for today is fuels reduction, right? So we're thinking about removing ladder fuels, spacing trees out to reduce fire risk, and make these forests resilient to wildfire, right? Fire is going to occur. These forests need to burn. They're fire adapted. And so we want to make sure that they don't burn down and that we protect the community that's in this area. But it's really important to remember that fuels reduction is a year-to-year, right, kind of approach, that we're thinking about the immediate risk of that year and removing those fuels to manage for the wildfire season that's coming up. But as Mary mentioned, the long-term goal here is to improve the overall forest health and condition of the stand, to make it more resilient long-term, to have trees that are resilient to fire, that are healthy and disease and insect-free, so that we can have a condition that's more sustainable into the future, and we're less worried about the fire risk moving on and not having to go every year we got to worry about fire and cut the fuels out. At some point we get to a situation where the forest is just resilient and we don't really have to do that much investment and intervention to help it through some of these wildfire disturbance events. So, right, we're focusing on very much removing these fuels now, but thinking long term, how do we help this forward in long-term trajectory become more resilient and healthy?
Creating a resilient forest, and what does that really mean? That means individual trees. We want fewer, larger trees, and so our goal with fuel reduction is really aiming to remove mainly smaller, weaker trees that would stand less of a chance in the case of a wildfire. And what we're really looking, the basics of fuel reduction, is increasing the distance of vegetation both on a horizontal and vertical axis. So I'm looking right here, and we have some smaller tan oak, and we have a big old Doug fir, and then we have some smaller Doug fir around here. And we're trying to think of how can we space those apart? What trees do we take that have probably less habitat value, that are more suppressed or weaker, aren't growing as vigorously? Those are the ones that we want to take, and we want to target at keeping what we call a thrifty tree. And that is a tree that is growing well, and also our larger trees, which are inherently going to be more fire resilient. They have thicker bark. They self-prune themselves. You can see there's not a lot of low branches on the older Doug fir, but on the younger Doug fir, we have all these little branches that, you know, when we're thinking about ladder fuels, we'd want to take off. So when I come to a spot and I'm looking at what to take, I think about the distance between the tree trunks, but I also want to look up, and I want to look at the canopy and see, are my branches overlapping? I want to avoid that. I kind of want them just touching each other, maybe a little separation, because they are going to keep growing and will again touch each other. So we're really looking to give each tree the most room to get more light. We're reducing competition, so there's more water per tree, more nutrients per tree. And we also think about, in the future, these things are going to be growing even more. So maybe we take more right now and we're like, oh, I'm kind of leaving a big gap between, but that's okay because that gap's going to eventually grow in together. So I'm going to start on this side and kind of just start marking through. I see I have these 3 tan oaks, and see how they're really close together? If I'm looking up, their canopies are kind of intertwined. I feel like I only need 1 of those. So which ones do you guys want to leave?
The big one.
Yeah. So I want to take these smaller ones. And I'm just giving them a squirt of paint so that we can visualize what's going to be taken. Now this is the tree that I want to leave, right? I want to give this big mamma jamma some space. So then I'm looking at these smaller Doug firs. Do we need all of them? I mean, I can straight off the bat look at this guy. Look how thin its crown is. It only has green foliage on one side. This is what we call a weak suppressed tree. I want to take this out. Now I have a bigger tree here, and this guy looks pretty healthy, right? Does the top look pointy to you? Yeah?
Yeah.
So, is this a tree that we want to take? I'm looking up and I see its branches are almost touching the base of that. So this is a tree that we could very well take, but also, you know, marking, everyone's going to do it differently, and you just have to be able to defend your position. What is the goal besides fuel reduction? What is our prescription? And our prescription is basically your work order of what to take and what to leave, and where you're doing it. So you're starting within 10 feet of the road. I'm always going to mark heavier around a road than further back, because if we think about our ignition points, that's the road. So we want to be heavier right along the road, and then we can feather it out. So that is a good point. You know, I've been talking about looking up and do the canopies, are they touching one another? So here, that madrone we're talking about keeping, its canopy's touching this redwood canopy. So does that mean we want to take it? You know, in an ideal world, I'd take a madrone, I'd put it in that gap, but I can't do that. So you try and get to some sort of condition. You might have a prescription that says thin to 17, 15, 20 feet between trees, but you realize we're working in a forest, we're working in a natural environment, and we can't control all of it. And so we're just trying to make the best decisions for the current conditions. What we as foresters call diameter at breast height, or DBH. And that is at 4.5 feet from the ground level on the uphill side of the tree. So that's like right here. So that's when we are talking about size of trees, what to take. That's the area that we're looking at, what size.
What do you think is going to happen when you open up, like when you remove these big trees? What's going to happen on the forest floor?
Probably grow more.
Yeah, right, because you're going to put more light on the forest floor. What's all the regen? What do you have in the understory right now?
Everything.
Yeah, you got a lot going on. You got a lot of hardwoods in there. You got maple. You got some, I think that's a bay, manzanita, madrone. So that's something to think about too when you're thinning, is we're thinning to remove continuity of fuel, but also we're adding more light to the forest floor. So how does that affect the regeneration of the stand as well?
I would almost think it adds more fuel, all that stuff on the ground, right? I mean,
Yeah.
all this, right?
Yeah.
Which in turn adds more work next year.
Okay.
Or it affects how you approach what as you're going now. Are you leaving more shade to help kind of keep that in control? Or when you come through and you start managing the underfuels, are you cutting more heavily to remove some of that future regeneration? So remember, like, as you know, Mary as a forester is constantly thinking, I don't know, 25, 50 years in the future. When she's marking these trees, she's thinking, this is current condition, but here's what I'm really trying to achieve. And so remember, like, you're in the moment, but we're thinking long-term forest health and resiliency, and we want to think about what that future stand condition will be that we're trying to achieve. So it's really important to think not just about the trees you're cutting, but what's happening below you too and regenerating.
Wait, can you talk specifically looking at that? What would you take out on the understory as you're adding a little more light in that zone?
Well, I mean, again, goals and objectives, and if we're thinking about fuel loading, we're probably, you know, maybe we're less worried about the species or the diversity of plants and more about the fact there's gonna be lots of shrubby growth in there. So maybe we're going really aggressive and removing a lot of that. But also, right, remember that's the next generation, that's the next cohort, that when these trees get older and they're gonna die, there's what's replacing the canopy. So we don't wanna nuke it, we don't wanna take everything out because it's the regeneration, it's the next cohort. So maybe we're thinking about what we want the composition, that structure to look like in the future, and maybe we want a nice mix. So maybe we have that little Doug fir seedling, sapling, and we have that bay. So maybe we're just spacing out our small regen as well and kind of thinning it out and having that diversity built into the regeneration.
It's worth adding that knowing what plants you're dealing with is really helpful here, because some plants are going to stump sprout, right? They're going to sprout from that basal material that you leave behind. So some stuff, if you cut it to the ground, it's just going to grow big and bushy and make more fuel for next time. And so some things are better to limb up and some things are better to cut to the ground. And it's back to your objectives. Are you also trying to create some habitat for wildlife, or are you just worried about fuel loads next to a road, right? So there's certain plants that are good to cut to the ground, like Douglas firs are really good to cut all the way to the ground as close as you can get. They won't stump sprout, but madrones will. So if you leave any material, that madrone's just going to grow right back up. So it's probably better to limb a madrone up if you can, or if your goal is just to get rid of it, you're just going to have to come and keep cutting it back, right? Does that agree with what you're saying?
Yeah, I was definitely heading towards this resprout versus non-resprout, which we can talk about more, but that's crucial too, is, you know, the trees are going to naturally regenerate through seed, but they're also going to resprout like crazy in some cases, and that's something you have to think about long term and how you're going to manage for that, right?
One of the big things I always tell people is there's never one and done vegetation management. Vegetation grows. That's great, but it just means that you're going to have to continuously be doing work. And so when you are deciding what to cut and how much to cut, that's something you think about. Do I need to take more now so I don't have to come back in the next 5-10 years? Do I want to do a lighter touch now because my client's really wanting to keep a lot for aesthetics? These are the things we think about. Also, going back to thinking about how much shade you have, I am more comfortable having less shade around roads. As we get further back from roads, we want to have what we call a higher canopy cover, because the more light, like you said, you have, the more things are going to grow. And what we're trying to do is keep a high percentage of shade to help suppress regrowth, so you don't have to come back. All right, what do you do with dead stuff? Yeah. So, yeah, so this stuff here, it's just a lot of fuel, right? And it's kind of a mess, and there's a lot of room for air to go through. So is it providing habitat? Maybe. A lot of little birds probably sit on it. But what's our goals and objectives here? We're right next to the road. It's a fuel reduction. I'd take all this little stuff. I'm not going to paint it because you just know it's dead and you should take it.
What would you do with this tree right here, this drone?
You want to talk about this one, Mike? You got...
Yeah, you know, so this would be an example of a tree that has that, what we were referring to before. It has the leaf blight, and it probably has more than that. It probably has some cankers on the branches. So you look at the tops of the canopy and of this particular tree, and a lot of it's dead. It's also resprouting from the base. And so these trees have these kind of adaptive strategies where, you know, if the above ground biomass is starting to die or can't produce a lot of sugars through photosynthesis, it resprouts. So maybe in my mind, I'm seeing this tree is this above ground biomass, the part of the tree we can see, is probably dying, and it's starting over. And so in my mind, this is an easy take because it's resprouting. If you leave it, it's going to die and keep resprouting. If you cut it, it's going to resprout. At least if you take it, you're removing that fuel that would otherwise be, it would come down. So
All right, so now we're in a clump of redwood. So we were talking about all those evergreen hardwoods that sprout from the base. Well, guess what? Redwood's really special and it also sprouts. So you get these clumps of redwood. And I think a lot of us have a great affinity towards redwoods. They're our big, majestic California tree, right? But there are times where you have these clumps and they should be thinned out. So here, what do you guys see?
Little ones.
Yeah, so you see you have some of these really nice big ones, and they are the clear winner because all these little guys are all what we say suppressed, right? They only have branches on one side, the top might be busted out. So these are the ones I don't want the root system to keep spending energy on.
Mary, how low would you cut those to the ground?
I always like having low stumps.
Like a foot?
Yeah, a foot or less is what you want to aim for. Especially with redwood too, it's going to re-sprout. And when we have redwood re-sprouting, we want it to come from low down on the stump. It can be higher on the stump, it could be on top of the stump, you've seen that. Those in the future, those trees are going to be weaker. They're not going to be as structurally sound. So we want to give our future trees the best chance, and we want them coming from the base, as close to the ground, rooted in the ground as possible. So the higher you cut your stump, the more chance there is to get sprouting that's not from the very base. Another thing to think about in clumpy areas, or how are you going to get the tree out? So I'm looking at this guy. It has a poor top. It doesn't have very much foliage. I feel like I'd want to take it. Mind you, it's too big for our prescription now, but just as an example. But I couldn't just mark this one and not mark things around it, because how would you get it out? So that's something you also have to think about, is not only what trees you want to get out, but the physical operations of it. Are you setting yourself up for success, or are you setting yourself up for a tree just to be hanging up and creating a danger? The deformed trees in the woods add a lot of we call it structure. So it's just something that wildlife are going to use. It's a more perching area. It's easier to climb up. It's something where an animal can sit on. It just adds a little more diversity. Diversity is always good in all parts of life, but in the woods especially. We want diverse species. We want diverse spacing. We want diverse sizes, and we want diverse structure. Sometimes it's nice to have a crew with people with varying thoughts on that, so that you do get a really mixed result. And in forestry, we like that. We call it skips and gaps, right? You know, we have areas that are a little denser, areas that are more open, and that leads to diversity and also for habitat diversity. So we just don't want to leave some areas too dense when we're doing a fuel reduction. And we want to do that because, again, I'm going back to diversity on the landscape. And one of the reasons why I want to leave a high number of diverse species is because we don't know what's going to happen in the future with climate change, with disease, with different droughts, with insects. We can have something take out a whole species, and then what's going to be left. So that's why it's so important to leave this high diversity, because we're just hedging our bets for the future.
So do you guys know what this tree is right here?
That looks like oak.
Well, if you look up a little higher, you see, okay, so there's all these seeds over there. So here's the fruits from this tree. So not an acorn, right?
Oh, okay.
So check this out, you guys.
What is that? Snowball? They go when they fall.
Yeah. So this is a big leaf maple.
Big leaf. Oh,
Big leaf maples are trees that need a lot of water, and so they're typically growing near what we call riparian zones, which are near creeks and streams and springs. And so it's also deciduous, like a lot of our oaks, So it loses its leaves in the winter.
Healing.
And this is a really nice tree for habitat. It's a really nice tree for animals. It's people sometimes eat the leaves. They wrap them up just like grape leaves around, so Native Californians have used them. They steam them up and wrap them around things. So this is not a tree that's necessarily a high fire risk. It's typically in wetter places. What would you do to this tree?
Limit.
Yeah? So how do you know in the wintertime which limbs are actually dead and which ones are still alive?
Doesn't matter. Tend so far up, and that's
Well, yeah, but not necessarily, because sometimes those limbs will come back down, and that's really nice. So
the base of the tree 10 feet up.
yeah, so when I look at a tree like this, I'm gonna look and say, okay, there's not a lot of leaves on this limb. It looks kind of broken. There's a lot of dead material out there. I'd take this one, and you want to, like you guys talked with Chris Bennett yesterday about, where you make your cuts, right? So, I'd take it right there. I'd take that one out. I might go on the downhill side and get some of those lower limbs, but you don't always have 10 feet to limb up on some of these trees. You're going to damage it if you take it too far. So take those lower ones is what I would do. And maybe our foresters will disagree with me. But on this one, I treat it a little differently than those conifers, which are kind of a little more a dime a dozen in this forest.
So this is your follow-up. A lot of times you're going to have to come back and follow up 3-5 years after treatment, especially when we have these resprouting hardwoods. Right now, they're at a size that I'm not really worried about them from a fuel standpoint. In the future, they're just going to get bigger. So do you want to just leave them for now and not take the time to cut these little guys and come back later to do more thinning, or you're here, might as well snip them off and knock them back another couple years? Snip them. All right.
I have a question about that. So if you have a whole bunch of them, would you maybe leave your tallest, happiest one so that it could grow up and shade out the others so you don't have to keep having to come back and pruning back these littles? So leave one or two that are looking like they're going to make it to treehood?
Yeah, so when I'm in a space with a lot of resprouting stuff, where they're kind of just a bunch of resprouts from a single stump, I like to come back and thin it to 1 or 2. And I like to do it at the time where there's a clear winner. And then I'm hopefully going to suppress any more resprouts so that the tree is focusing all its efforts on that 1 or 2 stems that we left.
If you want a tree there.
Yeah, that's a good point. So with our resprouting hardwoods, our madrone, our tan oak, our bay laurel, think about whenever you make a cut, it's going to have multiple stems come back. Are we making a worse problem then? Are we going to come back and follow up and thin out those sprouts later? That's something you have to think about. Our goals and objectives are to open up the space for emergency vehicles to go by, and it's also to reduce density, to have fewer trees on the landscape, both for fuel reduction and for increasing health and reducing competition.
I guess in the little spot we're standing in, let's just start talking about the species that we're working with. And right now we're in this little pocket of like tan oak. And what's really important about that is that there's an invasive disease called sudden oak death that is killing tan oak. And we're actually standing in some of that mortality. There's trees with the brown leaves standing, like those ones right there, kind of behind us. You see how that smaller tree has just all the brown foliage, the brown leaves on it? Yeah, and then if you look, it's hard to see, but up on the kind of further up above us, there's a bunch of tan oak in there too. So what's happening is this disease is killing these tan oak. And so when we're thinking about managing, and this question is much larger than just for fuels reduction, but managing for forest health in general, is this disease is going to kill tan oak. There's no way, we can't really stop it. It's just running through and it's causing a lot of mortality. So, right, we have dead trees now that we should be removing, but we have living trees that are going to die too, and so it's going to be adding potential fuel in the future and having a potential effect on fire behavior. So part of thinking about this is what's going to happen in the future, as we've been saying, and how do we think about thinning? Do we take more tan oak? Do we take the same amount that we would normally and then just have to come back and continually manage the mortality as it occurs? What's the strategy there? And it's pretty tricky and complicated because, as we were talking about before, every time you cut a tan oak, it resprouts. So if we take a bunch of tan oak right now because we know sudden death is going to kill them, we've now created a bunch of shrubby regeneration that's adding to fuel loading. So it's an interesting kind of conundrum, right? How do we think about this? How do we balance these needs? I don't know. We don't really have a good answer. I think we do know that you don't want to just remove all the tan oak, right? You don't want to get rid of all of them. That you want diversity. We talked about how important diversity is in forest health and the resiliency of the stand. We don't want to kill all the tan oak. There's no point in that.
Yeah, I don't think our scope of work is to clear cut everything.
Yeah, you don't want to clear cut. You don't want to do conversion or anything like that. But we definitely need to think about, there's a lot of tan oak in here. Let's thin it out. Let's maybe space it out more so we can slow down the spread. Definitely take out the dead trees and try to open it up a little bit so that maybe we can recruit some more growth of other tree species that aren't susceptible to sod. So it's a complicated factor, right? Invasive diseases and insects complicate forest management beyond. It makes it almost impossible to even think about long term how you're going to manage for something when you kind of have this vision of a lot of destruction and mortality.
We talked about how land use history has changed what it looks like now, and a lot of that in the beginning was logging and then the suppression of fire. And so if you look at our old stumps, we have some big old redwood stumps.
There's a big old fir up there.
Yep, and we have big old Douglas fir stumps. So we did have some of those big Doug fir here. And now what do we have? We still have some bigger Doug fir, we have some redwood, but the most abundant species right now is tan oak, and that's really a legacy of past management, because like Mike said, we opened up growing space for this species that resprouts from the base very easily. So how do we manage now to reduce our fuels, and is there a way we can kind of promote more healthy Doug fir and redwood without eliminating our other species, right? Doug fir is also great for animals. The squirrels eat their seeds. So you'll see a lot of little Doug fir cones that are stripped because they have animals eating their seeds. Mice also will eat it when they fall on the ground. So it is also a very important component of the forest too. Yeah. There are species that nest in them. A listed mammal is the Sonoma tree vole, and it will nest in old growth Doug fir is its preferable place to build its nest. So yeah, every species plays a role. Yeah.
Because I just thought it was just a ignition.
Yeah.
Ignition.
So I hear that a lot. Douglas fir are so flammable, right? And it's not that Douglas fir are more flammable, it's really a function of density and age that we're seeing. So these big Doug fir that, they're this big, they have thick bark, they are adapted to fire. They self-prune is what we say. Their lower branches start dying and falling off, so then you don't have a ladder. They're actually very fire resistant when they're that old and big, and when you have a lot of spacing. Where we're seeing pockets of Doug fir that are really igniting, it's because they're younger, they're more closely spaced, it's denser, they're younger, they have lower branches, so it acts as that ladder. So it's really more of a function of density and age than the species itself. We have different fuels, right? We have our 1 hour fuel, our 10-hour fuels, our 100-hour fuels, our 1,000-hour fuels. The boles of those trees that fell down, those are your 1,000-hour fuels. It's going to take a lot to ignite them. Once they are ignited, they're going to burn a really long time though. But, yeah. Well, then you want them to burn. But when you do have these big trees coming down, the fuel loading that you want to take care of first are the tops and the limbs. It's that smaller, flashier stuff. I like leaving some bigger tree trunks on the ground, in contact with the ground, because again, they're not as flammable, they're decomposing slowly. They're actually very good habitat for, you have amphibians, you have reptiles, you have small mammals. It's actually really great habitat, and you want more complex habitat. We don't want to just clear everything, right? One of the objectives of today is how can we do fuel reduction and still move the stand to a more natural condition. So another thing that we notice in the stand because of sudden oak death is we have some hazards here. And I know yesterday you guys talked about how you fall things, but we put orange flags on these guys. Yeah, because their tops have broken. They died, their tops have broken, and now they're all hung up. So we want to be careful walking under it. We need to be careful if we fall them. And I think the biggest point just for safety is know your limits. If you have to leave a pocket because it's unsafe for you to fall, that is fine. That's not going to be the only, it's not going to mean that now all the work you've done is for naught. You know, having pockets that you need to leave, that's fine. Again, habitat, more structure diversity. Number one, we want to be safe.
Yeah, like, you know, you might be able to handle this, but for example, where those 4 stems fell, I would probably just, like, you know, exclude that from any current management practices today, because that's a mess and you don't want to be anywhere near that if things shift. Yeah. Situational awareness, right? We want, especially on the roadsides, it's a little bit more open. We can definitely see the hazards a little bit easier. Sometimes it's harder to remember to look up or to spot them. So we definitely want to make sure we got eyes up when we're working in these conditions.
And especially here right now, look how tall these trees are. The taller they are, the more likely they're going to hang up on things, right? The more room you need to fall them. And so that's another way to decide what to take and what to leave. If you have 2 trees next to each other and they're kind of similar, which one's going to be safer to fall? And that's a completely appropriate decision-making tool.
This tree, looking up, I noticed you marked it, but if you look up here, what is different about this tree right here? Yeah. Anybody know what this tree is? It's a dogwood. So yeah, it's a dogwood, and this guy is not so much of a hazard. And I think it just got marked because the marker didn't look up and realize it's not a not a tan oak, right? So sometimes don't forget when you're looking at, you know, when you see these marks, look up and be like, oh, wait a minute, I'm gonna leave this guy. It's not a fire hazard. It's never gonna get bigger than this. And it's a nice diverse tree in this landscape.
Yeah, you had these really widely spaced, huge trees. That doesn't mean there was nothing in between them, much, but right? Definitely not as much. Redwoods, I mean, they're gonna shade that up. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So when we look at this and how much tan oak there is, you know, there was probably a quarter of that amount, you know, in the past. So we really changed the species makeup of this landscape. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I know we have too many small trees. We want to be pushing our stands, our forests, to have fewer larger trees, and that is going to be a healthier stand, and it's going to be a more fire resilient stand and a more insect disease and drought tolerant stand.
So this goes back to what Mary was talking about with, you space things out vertically, so you don't have fuel ladders, but you can space things out horizontally so that you could leave a bush and then have another bush 20 feet away, rather than just cut them all down, if you're thinking about habitat.
I almost hate to ask this, but what are the implications for sudden oak death in this stuff relative to chipping and broadcasting?
Ooh, okay.
Keep it on site.
Yeah, that's the thing. There's so there is a zone of infestation as recognized by the state for stone oak death, but basically that zone of infestation is all of the coastal counties from Del Norte down to Monterey or San Luis Obispo. Within that zone of infestation, there's no regulation, right? You can move stuff around, but best management practices are to leave it on site. We know sod is here. We know stone oak death is here. You're going to be working in areas where it's not established yet, or it's just beginning to get established, and you do not want to help with that migrated assistance movement of that disease. So really, BMPs is good sanitation, keeping all your material on site, or burning or sanitizing your equipment, and if you do have to move it, making sure you're not moving to areas that aren't infected yet.
And be very conscious about the leafy parts, or especially about not moving that.
So chips and stuff, the chips themselves, it's really hard to spread sod, but it's because you pick up the foliage or bark, anywhere the spores are at. It's really the soil. It's the soil. It's when you pick up the mud on your boots and then you go walk somewhere else, you spread the spores. And so that's really where we want to be the most careful. It's tricky. It's a very hard disease to manage, and we've been studying it for 25 years now, and we still don't have a really good solution, and frankly probably isn't one. It's good at what it does. It's a good invader a little bit, but a really important thing to remember about pruning is we don't want to take too much of the living canopy, because that's how the tree survives, right? That's how it produces food. So generally a good rule of thumb is 30%, no more than 50. This tree is obviously, like, we're given the prescription we would take this tree, but this is a really good example because it's nice full like Christmas tree canopy, and we can visualize what 30 or 50% looks like. Just think about if you took 50% of that tree's canopy, that's a lot. That's a really significant stress to that tree. Maybe not so much this time of year because they're starting to kind of do their winter thing, but imagine if you were doing this work in the spring, which is very likely you'll be thinning year round whenever you have the contract. And if this tree is just waking up out of dormancy or out of its like torpor, and it's starting to move water and produce sugars, and you take away like 50% of its capacity to feed itself, you could potentially kill that tree. And so you want to make sure that we don't do that. We don't cause unintentional damage and mortality through this practices. So we want to really minimize how much we're taking. And if we need to take more, maybe we take a little bit at first and then come back at another entry and take a little bit more to get to what we want. But just make sure you always have that just always have a good view of the canopy and think about how much of that am I taking, and think about where the branches lead to. Like a branch may start lower on the bowl, but it may be a significant part of the canopy that you take that, and you could remove a lot of that foliage. So yeah, to meet prescription, if you have to take more than 50% of the canopy, then that's probably a take tree. Yeah, for sure.
And you can see someone has pruned in the past just for...
Is that what all these are?
Yeah. But then they left it all on the ground right there.
I knew we were coming, huh?
So, does that really help if you're maybe reducing some ladder fuel, but you're increasing the fuel on the surface? No, it doesn't.
Put it on the bottom?
Our surface fuels are our drivers of fire, actually. And having it up against the trunk of the tree.
Even worse, huh?
Exactly, because it's going to light on fire and it's going to burn for a while, and it can actually cook the cambium or the living tissue of that tree. So when we do fuels reduction, thinking about what we do with the slash is really important, because just putting it on the ground actually is not helping your cause in a lot of cases.
I would agree.
And right, we manage slash because insects and disease. Again, the dead material that, not necessarily for the hardwoods and redwoods, but most conifers, if you prune them up and you pack that slash or you pile that slash under them, that stuff becomes infested with insects so they can spread to your living tree. So you may do all this work to improve the health of your stand and thin your tree up to improve vigor, but then if you don't manage all the material you cut off of it, you can create the conditions that the insects will infest that material and then move to the trees you're trying to save. So that's Another thing to think about is we don't want to do all this work, leave a bunch of slash in piles around the trees we did the work on, and then the insects kill the tree. Anyway, yeah.
This forest, mostly what we're seeing is tan oak, which is not a true oak, even though it produces an acorn. But tan oaks are more coastal and they grow around in coniferous forests, so in redwoods and Doug fir forests. But we haven't seen a lot of the other oaks, and oaks are a really huge component of California forests, and they're super important for lots of reasons, for wildlife, for people, and there's not a ton of oak regeneration in California. So you don't see a ton of little oaks surviving. Can you guys think of reasons why?
The bigger trees are not letting them grow, or?
In some cases, but like we changed our management, right? We're not burning as much. So traditionally for the last 10, 15,000 years, people would burn through the oak forest really regularly. And so that would change the soil chemistry, reduce the competition, keep some of the conifers out of the oaks, and also the grazing regimes were really different. So now we have cows, sheep, pigs, and turkeys moving through the landscape and eating a lot of the acorns. So we're not seeing a lot of baby oaks regenerate. And so when you see a little baby oak on the side of a road or in an area where you're working, it's worth looking around. If you have a lot of them growing up that are really tall, you can thin them out. But if you just see one, it's important to leave it, I think. And the reason you want to leave it is because you don't see a lot of new baby oaks making it up past that browse line, you know, the browse line being as high as the deer can eat. And we want those babies to come up because we're seeing a lot of our big old oaks die. And we need the next generation to replace them. So this little guy, if I was moving through here, I might take these other trees, but I would definitely leave that oak. So how do you know you have an oak?
Shape of the leaf.
Shape of the leaf, yep, that's super important. Some of our oaks are deciduous. They lose their leaves in the winter. Some of our oaks are evergreen, so that's the live oaks. They have leaves that don't have any lobes, but like you're talking about, these guys have these big lobes and you can see they're turning yellow, so you know they're deciduous. We can talk about different oak species, but there's only a couple here, so we won't do too much of that. But when you see a baby oak, in my perspective, you protect it because we don't have a lot of them and we want them to survive. So the blue oaks have very small leaves, and maybe we can show a picture later. They're kind of blue looking and they're lobed, and they really common on the dry, harsh soils inland. So you have them in Hopland, I know, and they grow really slowly. And it might be 50 years old and this tall. It might be, they might be this thick around and 100 years old. So if you cut it down, you're cutting down something that it took 100 years for it to get there. It just depends, because they're on such harsh soil and it's so dry and it's so hard for them to grow to maturity. It's important to know that, like, when you have these trees, you might not get it back if you cut it down. Do you guys know this one right here?
What would you say, coyote?
That's a tick brush.
Coyote brush, tick brush. So the thing about common names is we can have a lot of names for the same plant. So this is coyote brush. It is in the same family as sunflower, so it has these little puffs of white on it. And this is a native plant, but it's very invasive in the sense that it'll move into any disturbed area. These little seeds will fluff off and fly around, so you see it everywhere. It can also have a lot of dead material in it. It is totally appropriate from an ecological perspective to just cut this to the ground. It'll stump sprout, it'll resprout, and the new material will be green and fresh and less flammable. So from an ecological perspective, it's okay to cut this. It's a really important plant for pollinators. So if you can leave like a specimen here and there, great, but it's completely fine to cut it to the ground and let it, just let it do its thing. Anyways, just wanted to point that out because it's a cool plant. It's really important, but it's really invasive and really easily managed in the sense that you can just lop it. In some cases like this, it probably wasn't as prevalent as it is on this slope historically, but it likes disturbed places, so it just moved in, and it's going to be actually protective for new plants coming in, right? So you could have little baby oaks growing in there, and they wouldn't be browsed down by deer. What would you guys do to this one?
Leave it for character.
Nurture it.
So you guys know California plants are adapted to fire, right? This is a system that has had fire in it for a really long time. And so a lot of our plants are those stump sprouters, right? You cut them down, they'll grow back up because they're used to being exposed to things that killed them. This is one plant where some manzanitas will, and most of them won't. So if you cut this, it's not gonna look better. It's just gonna die. So either make the decision to cut it nicely or cut it all the way to the ground. That's my advice about them. They're really important habitat plants. You probably know they produce manzanita berries. They're food for birds, they're food for bear, they're food for coyote, so they're important. But if they're also flammable, and so if you have to take it, like I said, cut it nicely or cut it to the ground. That's my philosophy on them. If you can leave them, you can limb them up and they'll look really nice and they'll still be that important habitat plant. But if you can't do it, it's never going to look good if you just cut. Yeah. You guys have anything to add to that?
I was going to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Like, how would you approach pruning that? The same way you would a tree, or?
Yeah, so we have to kind of come down to see it, but if you guys, let's see. So if you look at this, you guys see this cut? It's not healing, right? So if you're gonna limit, I would take it to there. You can take the dead material off, but yeah, I mean, you'd limit, I would treat it kind of like a little bit like a tree. These guys will get overshadowed in a mature forest and they'll die back, and you'll see that a lot. There's some just this way on the road. But you can see this one also got damaged in last year's snowstorm. So in this case, I would say this guy's probably a goner. But if it was a good specimen, I would just kind of clean up the dead stuff and lift it up so that you don't have the flammable material on the bottom. So, yeah, that seems like that's what you would do. Yeah, but it won't grow back if you cut it. So leaving this material is not going to make anything good. Acorns are an essential food for people, for animals, and the trees provide all kinds of habitat for insects and mammals and birds. So one thing that's happening is these Douglas firs are moving into our oak forests and encroaching in on the oaks and competing with them for water and for sunlight. And if you look back here at this beautiful giant black oak right here, you can see all these little Douglas firs growing in around it and starting to crowd it out. And so the black oak is having to reach up further, and it's getting leggier and weaker as it grows. So one priority that I would say we should have when we're thinking about fuel reduction is that tree is not a fire risk, right?
Right.
But all the little Doug firs around it,
Like little matches on?
yeah, they're little matches. So not only are they crowding it out and competing for resources, they could burn it down. So what would you guys do in this forest here?
Thin it out.
Yeah.
What would you cut?
The big one. So it don't burn. The little matchstick, so it
Thin
don't
out
get
some of this fir. But you got a bunch of abundance of it.
If it was me, I'd probably cut 9 out of 10 of these Doug firs. What would you do, Mary?
Yeah, I would. We have some bigger ones that are outside your prescription, but I would take all the little stuff. So this is another way to think about what you're cutting too. You can find these really unique trees, these really large ones that you know you want to keep and work your way out. We call it radially thinning it. So you start from there and you just take things away from it because you want that tree to have a lot of room and you don't want to have a lot of ladders into it. So like Jen said, really with the lack of low intensity frequent fire, Doug fir was able to move into these areas. And even though it's native, and we don't want to eliminate it everywhere, in certain areas, it didn't usually grow there because it would just burn up when you'd have these frequent fires. But now we took that away. They've established, and conifers, they just grow faster and taller than oaks. So they're really competing. But obviously, even though you have these Doug fir that are as tall or taller than that oak is much older, much older. So yeah, this is an area, oak woodlands generally are very spaced apart. The trees themselves are spaced well apart, because look how much space it's taking. Again, look up, see how big its branches are reaching.
It almost reaches out as far as it is tall.
Yeah.
From one side to the other.
So the other thing here is there's another skinny little oak that's trying to get in there. And so another way to free up this oak here, this younger oak that might replace that big oak someday, is free that smaller oak too. So sometimes called pepperwood, sometimes called laurel, sometimes called California bay laurel. This is also a really nice riparian tree, so you'll find it in dense stands next to the creeks. And it can have a lot of little seedlings. It's really, so I know you guys probably know this already. It's pretty easy to identify if you break a leaf and sniff it, of course, right?
Put in a boiling pot of water on a wood stove.
Yeah, the bay nuts are critical food for squirrels and other animals, and also for people, right? Have you ever had behechne? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a really great thing, but it can be really prolific, lots of little starts. So this one you could cut back, but you can also, especially if you're in these riparian zones, let a few of the ones that look like they're gonna be winners, let them grow.
Bay laurels are vigorous sprouters, and they too, even we like them in the cooler, more riparian areas, but they are another species that, with the lack of fire, has been able to move into areas that they didn't inhabit 100 years ago.
Here, that you should know the difference between, even though they look alike. So come check this out, Chris. Okay.
Look for cedar.
So, you see this tree right here? And you see this one right here?
Yep.
Okay, so this is a feel thing. If you come up and you grab this.
Thicker.
This is the one you use beds for.
Well,
Not the
okay,
big
so
one.
that one, how does it feel? Is it
Soft.
Soft. Okay, now grab this one right next to you.
Oh, geez.
This side. Yeah. Oh, geez, right?
Yeah.
So this one has these little spear tips, and it's really flat. It looks a lot like a redwood until you get close, and it's not soft. This is not a very common tree, and it's nice to keep.
And what is it again?
California nutmeg.
Nutmeg.
So it produces a weird little fruit that's, a seed is kind of like a little nut. It's a conifer, but it's a really old one. So if you come up across it and you feel it and you're like, ouch, then that is actually an unusual tree that's worth just limbing up and leaving.
That's amazing.
So it's kind of unique, and it's worth keeping your eyes. This is part of like that look up once in a while when you're working and see what you see. So it looks a little bit like the madrone in the sense that those got those big, strong leaves, but they're smaller than the madrone leaves, and they have like a serrated edge, right? Like a knife. This is called Toyon. And this guy will totally stump sprout when you cut it down. This is a brush that you'll find in really dry areas. You'll find it out in the chaparral. You'll find it in oak woodlands. It's a really common California plant. It responds very well to burning. Like you burn it, it's gonna grow again. And so my advice when you can is, if you don't wanna leave a big bushy thing when you're done with your job, like, you know, it'll grow up the next year, it's gonna look like a big bush, is if you can limb it up. Again, like that's gonna produce a tree rather than a big bush. Your job is going to dictate what you're actually doing, right? So this guy, you'll also find a mature bush this time of year is going to have a whole bunch of red berries on it. That'll help you identify it. Would you agree with that? Like that you'd limit up? I mean, sometimes you'll have to cut it down.
Yeah.
It's kind of a borderline.
Yeah, and just with all the sump sprouters, just take that extra little second to think Am I going to make this work worse by making a brushy, sprouty mess?
You're not going to be here in 5 years?
No, we always think into the future what it's going to look like.
Oh, okay.
And it doesn't look like much right now because the leaves are mostly gone, but you can tell because it's this weird little leafless green thing. The best way, do you guys know the best way to kill Scotch broom?
Yeah, pulled out by the roots.
Yep, exactly.
I did a whole side clearing for this lady, couple up there in Leggett.
Uh-huh.
So it took me like almost a week because I was around a turn. So I cleared, that was all brushes, cleared it all up, had burn piles. There was going by saying thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is an invasive plant from Europe.
That's why it's called Scotch.
Yes, and then we also have the French broom, which is similar but has 3 soft leaflets on it. These are all in the bean family, and they produce seeds that are really durable and will survive fires. So the best thing to do is when you're getting these out of the ground is do it before they flower. You're working all year, so you can't always do that. But and obviously the best thing to do is also pull them out by their roots. They will also stump sprout. So if you just leave the tops, then they'll just come back.
They're pretty easy to pull out too.
Yes, and you also don't want to scatter those seeds around. So if you are pulling them on a site, don't chip them and spray them out into the woods, because you will then create a much, much worse problem. You probably know this already, right? But those seeds, they'll survive fire, they will survive chipping, anything you do to them, they stay in the seed bank for years. So something to consider when you get rid of these is burning is good, but burning it all in one big pile so it's hot, rather than scattering it around and burning it. What other ways would you get rid of this stuff?
Just really, you could continuously cut it forever. Some people think if you cut it during the late summer when it's most water stress, that's more helpful than if you cut it earlier. But really, to kill it, you need to pull it up. But it's going to come back because, like Jen said, those seeds are really durable, and actually fire activates them. You'll get a lot more broom, both French broom and Scotch broom, after fires a lot of time. So it's kind of that's why they're invasive. They're incredibly durable and they keep coming up. But when you are in an area where you don't have very many, that's when it's really important to get it so you don't end up with a big problem. So who wants to pull that up?
You're on it. This is the best time of year.
When the soil's moist. Thank you.
Yeah. And of course, like, one of the problems with these is because they're in the bean family, they create, here, can I borrow this? Can you see those little nodules on the roots?
Yep.
Those little nodules house bacteria in them that fix nitrogen from the air. And that means they add nitrogen to the soil and they change the soil chemistry. California native plants don't like their soil chemistry changed. And so they can outcompete the natives by changing the soil chemistry, and then they spread really fast. So these guys are just really good at changing everything and taking over everything. And then, of course, they're a huge fire risk. So pull up anything in the pea family and the bean family, and it would have that. Well, just the little balls on them, yeah. That's just housing for bacteria.
We wanted to talk about the legacy of land use here and evidence of past logging, which of course are the stumps, but also right now we're standing on a skid trail. So these are the trails that they got logs out of the woods on. Yeah, so skid trails can be sources of erosion and sediment. They can be great ways to walk around the forest and access the forest. And they're also kind of clear areas that if you're doing pile and burning, they're great places to put your piles on. You know, they're usually gentler slopes. You're not going to have a lot what we call rollout, where something on fire can leave the pile and roll down the hill. You know, when you're working in steeper areas like this, these are key areas to place your slash to deal with. So. And they're also clear. It's a nice, wide, long, clear area that you can fall things into. You can see here we have a lot more of our white oaks around the edge where they're getting a lot of light. This is also probably a different soil type here. But this is a really habitat-rich area where we call it an ecotone. So it's kind of the transition between a grassland and a more evergreen forest. And again, what do you see around the edges?
Brush.
Yeah, all that brush, which is great bird habitat, but it's also great ladder fuels, right? And so it's just, if you imagine a fire coming through here, it's going to burn low.
Right there,
Yeah, low on the grass, it's going to hit that brush and it's going to ladder up into the canopy. So when fuel reduction is your goal, you want to eliminate that brush there, or just leave one kind of isolated by itself. Yeah. I think the main points, look up.
And down.
And down.
All the way around.
Yeah, I know you guys are working hard and you're trying to move fast, but sometimes if you're thinking about long-term ecology and leaving the landscape in a state where it's going to look better in 10 years, slowing down a little bit and looking up and looking down is always really helpful. And knowing your plants is just fun. So not just helpful in terms of knowing what you're doing, but it's also really fun to just know what you're seeing and interacting with and what you can do to make the forest healthier.
Across the creek is an area that has been cleared in the past, and you see how open it is? Yeah. We won't always get to that stage in the work that we do or that you guys do, but that's something to think about on how widely spaced some of those redwood clumps are. If there were more smaller trees of different ages in there, that would make me really happy. But you also see that you have some stuff sprouting and that you have these larger logs on the ground, right? And just because we have those doesn't mean that that's a high fire risk, right? Think about if a fire went through there, it kind of just creep around. But those large logs are providing a lot of habitat benefits to our forest floor. I liked this area just as an example of maybe what we are moving towards, our desired future condition, as we call it. Just to keep in mind that, we want to have space between things. It's okay to have clumpier areas, wider areas. And in this area, we have a madrone, we have our redwoods, we have our Doug fir. It's actually pretty diverse, even though there's not that many trees per acre in that area. But this also doesn't mean that you always have to cut it so hard that it gets to this point. This is just one example. And it's really important to have a diversity of densities on the landscape as a whole, too. So we don't want everything to look the same. So you want some areas that are really open, you want some areas that are a little dense, and some places in the middle.